Looking for something to read? Well, these are the books that I've written. Hop on down to the description to find the Amazon links for all 4 of them, and keep your eyes open for more in the future. With that said, on to the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer, and welcome to this Halloween edition of Genre Benders, Obscurities, and Flawed Gems, where we look at the spookiest stuff you've never heard of. Of course, there is a chance you've heard of these ones, since they're available on a lot of collections these days. But even with their availability, most people don't seem to talk about them. First things first, though. I assume you're all familiar with the Wolfman?
What am I saying? Of course you know about the Wolfman. Everybody does. Larry Talbot is the most iconic werewolf in the world. Even as the concept has evolved and changed throughout the years, most of us still picture Lon Chaney Jr. when we think of werewolves, and we default to his movie when we think of werewolf lore rather than, the lore that existed for centuries before film was even invented.
But Talbot was not the only lycanthrope in Universal's library. In fact, he wasn't even the first. So today we'll be looking at the other 2 attempts at werewolf movies that Universal produced, to see what they contributed to the legacy and perhaps figure out why they ended up forgotten.
To be fair, the first one at least has a recognizable title. Thank Warren Zevon for that.
True, Snazzy, but even with the song's contribution, I bet most people still haven't seen 1935's Werewolf of London. So let's begin with the plot summary as usual.
Dr. Wilfred Glendon is a botanist on an expedition to the planet of dinosaurs?
Okay, it's actually meant to be somewhere in Tibet, but those are clearly the Vasquez Rocks, which have appeared in a multitude of sci-fi movies. In fact, this was the first time they were ever depicted on film. And go figure, it was to depict a terrestrial landscape rather than an extraterrestrial one.
Anyway, Glendon is here in search of the Mariphasa lupina lumina, a flower with 2 unique traits. It only grows in one Tibetan valley, and it only blooms under the light of a full moon. He finds the flower, but not before getting attacked and bitten by something in the dark. He returns to London to experiment with the plant in a controlled environment and receives a visit from Dr. Yogami. This mysterious man claims that the flower is the only cure for lycanthropy, or as he calls it,
werewolfery. Lycanthrophobia is the medical term.
Well, that's going to nag at my brain forever.
Mine too, buddy. Mine too.
Anyway, Yogami seems to know that Glendon has contracted lycanthropy, and he is afflicted with it himself. Glendon, being a man of science, doesn't believe this silly story. Until he feels the full effects, that is.
Even though the Wolfman gets most of the credit for writing modern werewolf lore, a lot of what we know actually originates in Werewolf of London.
The full moon in particular is this film's greatest contribution, as that is specifically what triggers the transformation. The Wolfman never specifies that the moon has to be full, just bright. Fullness wasn't a requirement until later. This movie is also where the idea of lycanthropy spreading through a bite comes from, as that was not previously part of the folklore. The only reason Werewolf of London doesn't get credited is because it spent years wallowing in obscurity.
I actually wish I'd seen this movie sooner so I could have been more thorough when reviewing the remake of The Wolfman. After my first viewing of Werewolf of London, I was actually surprised to learn how many elements from that film made its way into the 2010 remake.
Remember how I said Glendon gets bitten in Tibet? That's where Sir John is when he gets bitten. There's a fight between 2 werewolves in the remake's climax, and 2 lycanthropes also have a scuffle in Werewolves of London. Sadly, the budget didn't allow for both of them to be transformed for it, but I still suspect this directly influenced the remake.
Even the way things play out between Talbot and Gwen at the end of the remake feels like it was influenced by this film. Check it out.
Lisa, don't you know me? Lawrence, you know me. You know me, remember me.
Like I said, I really wish I had seen it before making that video.
Don't blame yourself. Like you said, this movie got swept under the rug.
Which is honestly too bad, because it doesn't really deserve that fate. Although Werewolf of London isn't quite as good as The Wolfman, it's still a well-made film in its own right, and actually provides a very interesting take on lycanthropy.
Normally, we imagine werewolves to be almost like rabid animals, totally lacking in rationality or temperance, existing only to hunt and kill.
While that is present in Werewolf of London, Glendon is anything but mindless when he transforms. Let's compare and contrast.
When Talbot transforms, he immediately goes into the snarling beast mindset, abandoning any thought that doesn't involve hunting and killing. When Glendon undergoes his first transformation, he immediately heads to the lab where the flower is, remembering that it's the only thing that can restore him.
Mind you, he's fully transformed when he does this, yet he's still thinking clearly.
Granted, he still can't resist the urge to kill once he becomes a monster, but his mannerisms show that he retains a certain level of self-awareness as he does.
Can you even imagine what that would be like?
Talbot's mind at least goes blank when he's a wolf, meaning he has no control over himself and no clear memory of his nocturnal actions. Glendon has just enough of his rational mind intact to know what he's doing, but not enough to stop himself.
Man, that's almost worse than what Talbot goes through. It is, but it ends up tempered by the fact that Glendon just isn't as likable as Talbot. If I had to guess, that's the main reason Werewolf of London wound up falling to the wayside while the Wolfman flourished.
I'm not saying that Henry Hull gives a bad performance, mind you. He's great at conveying the tortured anguish that comes with lycanthropy. That said, though, he just doesn't have the same instant charm that Lon Chaney Jr. had as Talbot. From the moment we first see Talbot, we connect with him because he's a friendly everyman. Glendon, however, is a very rigid figure who isn't as easy to connect with, and thus he's not as endearing as a protagonist. Now, one could argue that Chaney was in more films and thus had more opportunities to ingrain himself in people's minds, but I don't think that's a factor.
Bear in mind that Bela Lugosi only played Dracula twice, one of those times in a comedy, and yet everyone still thinks of him when they think of Dracula because his performance was just that good.
That's what it ultimately comes down to. Henry Hull was good, but Lon Chaney Jr. was great. As I said, that's probably why this movie got overshadowed.
Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, so let's get back on track. Another significant element of the film is how it treats lycanthropy itself.
There's an intentional vagueness about if the phenomenon is scientific or supernatural, which not even the two afflicted scientists know for certain.
To be honest, both options are equally terrifying.
If lycanthropy is supernatural, that means there are forces governing the universe well beyond anyone's ability to comprehend them, let alone control them. On the other hand, if lycanthropy is a biological condition, that means everything we know about biology is dead wrong, and there are things that can potentially warp and twist us beyond recognition for which there is no remedy.
That's another thing this movie puts forward. There is no cure for lycanthropy in this picture.
The Tibetan flower is specified by Ogami to only be a treatment that staves off the transformation for a single night. The effects are not permanent, and given how rare the plant is, there's an understandable desperation to possess it.
Question. Is there a deeper subtext to this movie?
Explain.
It's the whole idea of a disease being contracted by someone in which fluids are exchanged and then needing a lifelong treatment to keep the symptoms at bay. You have to see it too.
Oh, you mean the STD interpretation. Well, there might actually be something to that.
You all heard Snazzy's description just then. As stated, lycanthropy is depicted in this film as a disease for which there is a treatment but no cure, and it is transferred from one man to another.
It sure does sound like a metaphor for STDs and homosexuality, doesn't it?
Specifically, the STD would have to be something like syphilis, which affects both the outward appearance and the mind, just as lycanthropy does.
And yes, I do believe the homosexual undertones are intentional here.
Oftentimes, I find that most people who claim that such and such a story is gay are severely misinterpreting the material and failing to understand the difference between brotherly love and erotic love.
In Werewolf of London, though, the subtext is clearly pointing in that direction.
Indeed, Glendon generally seems more comfortable around men than women. Then there's the way Glendon and Yokami both have this shared secret about an affliction one gave to the other on a moonlit night. Heck, consider this extended sequence with two old women who let out a room to Glendon. The scene provides some levity, but taken out of context, seeing the two peeping on him in his room through a keyhole and discovering something shocking about him only adds to the metaphor.
Now you might be thinking, Omni, what makes you specifically believe that this was intentional and not a misinterpretation like you alluded to earlier?
Omni, what specifically makes you believe this was intentional and not a misinterpretation like you alluded to earlier?
Good timing. Well, for starters, the allegory is very different from the Wolfman's allegory about Jewish persecution. But moreover, the screenwriter, John Colton, was gay.
I don't think he was as open as James Whale, but nonetheless, knowing this about him increases the likelihood of the metaphor being deliberate. To be clear, I found no information to suggest that he was syphilitic or had any sort of STD, which in itself doesn't prove or disprove a thing, but the metaphor is still clear.
Bear in mind, though, that this is purely subtext.
Werewolf of London is not an openly gay film, nor is it openly anti-gay. John Colton was simply using horror as allegory for things that weren't expressed in the 30s, and he did so in a way that makes the film layered rather than shallow, and thus accessible to a wider audience.
All of those elements combine to make Werewolf of London worth checking out at least once. And to be honest, I think it deserves a little more credit for what it contributed to modern werewolf lore. As we all know, the 40s introduced the world to the Wolfman, who would become Universal's tragic anti-hero henceforth. However, between his apparent curing in House of Dracula and his relapse in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, the studio would attempt to branch out with She-Wolf of London. It's included on most Wolfman collections these days, but after watching it, you're liable to wonder why.
In the early 20th century, a wealthy heiress named Phyllis Allenby is soon to be married to barrister Barry Lanfeld. Yes, there's a barrister named Barry, just go with it. This happy occasion is only sullied by a string of vicious murders happening in the neighborhood, which rumors are attributing to a werewolf. Indeed, eyewitnesses have described a wolf woman skulking about as of late. One morning, Phyllis wakes up surrounded by evidence that she went outdoors in the night, and though she has no memory of doing this, she fears that she already knows what happened. The Allenby family is believed to be cursed with lycanthropy, and Phyllis dreads that she is the wolf woman murdering people. Her Aunt Martha assures her that her fears are unfounded, but there is clearly more going on than meets the eye.
From here on out, I'm going into spoiler territory with this film, and I feel no shame in doing so because of its greatest flaw. It tries to weave a mystery, but gives away too much too early, thereby rendering that mystery completely pointless.
Not even 8 minutes in, we get a scene that makes the twist obvious. The aforementioned Aunt Martha and her daughter Carol have a discussion about their true heritage. It seems that despite the respective honorifics of aunt and cousin, they are not related to Phyllis at all. They are simply caretakers, and thus have no legal entitlement to the Allenby estate. This is a large part of why Martha disapproves of Carol's infatuation with a poor artist, and she would much rather her daughter marry a wealthy man like Barry.
Snazzy, care to take any guesses?
Sure. Martha is going out at night murdering people under the guise of the she-wolf and gaslighting Phyllis into thinking she's cursed. That way, as Phyllis isolates herself and slowly loses her mind, she can maneuver Carol closer to Barry so they can marry, thus allowing them to continue living in luxury.
Bullseye, but for those who think it's a red herring, it's pretty much confirmed not by what we see, but what we don't see.
There is a notable absence of werewolf footage early on, and nothing that would make the audience wonder about what might really be happening.
Again, contrast that with the Wolfman.
Even when it was playing with the idea that Talbot might just be losing his mind, we still saw him transform and prowl the woods. The refusal to show anything like that in She-Wolf of London is equivalent to the director holding up a neon sign that plainly states there is no literal she-wolf.
Combine that with the massive spoilers revealed by the villain in the movie's opening moments, and the twist can be seen coming from a mile away.
Oh, and for the 3 people who still might not get it, there's an early shot of the so-called she-wolf leaving the house in which her face is visible, and we can clearly see that it's Martha because she looks nothing like Phyllis. No matter how you look at it, this was a very poorly handled mystery.
Unfortunately, the movie hinges on that twist, which means its failure to properly execute it brings everything else down.
We're supposed to feel a similar sympathy for Phyllis that we feel for Talbot, but we can't. In Talbot's case, he's in a bad spot whether he's insane or cursed because he's afflicted by something either way. In Phyllis's case, we know that she's neither cursed nor insane, but simply being gaslit by the real killer. Now yes, we should be able to feel sympathy for her being in that situation as well. The problem is that the movie genuinely thinks we can't tell what's going on, and thus doesn't focus on that aspect of the story.
This makes the viewing experience more frustrating than intriguing.
In short, the movie thinks that it's smarter than us and expects us to be shocked by the most obvious twist in the world instead of being honest about depicting a case of psychological torment, right?
Pretty much. Honestly, the bigger twist would have been if Phyllis did turn out to be a werewolf and kills Martha for trying to frame her. If the movie had been exactly the same other than that, I would not have seen that coming. You know, all things considered, I think I understand why these movies were forgotten.
For She-Wolf of London, it's obvious. The movie thought it was cleverer than it actually was, and thus botched the most important aspect of the plot. Werewolf of London is much better and more layered, but if you compare Glendon to Talbot, you realize that he's a slightly weaker protagonist.
In the end, the Wolfman had all the right elements packaged together in all the right ways, which allowed it to move to the front of the pack, while these two movies lagged behind.
Well, that's the way it goes sometimes.
Indeed, Snazzy, but both movies are readily available these days, so people can watch them and decide for themselves if they're worth remembering. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. If you want to see She-Wolf of London's plot done correctly, I suggest watching The Beast with Five Fingers instead. Although I guess by saying that, I basically spoiled that movie as well. Sorry.
Thank you all for watching. If you want to see us keep doing what we're doing, you might consider doing all the usual YouTube things, as well as hopping down to the description to find links to DeviantArt, Patreon, Twitter, and links for the different books in the Tales from the Omnivault universe. Your support is naturally appreciated. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.